What secret do you have that could destroy your life if it were revealed? Story 1. When my boyfriend at the time cheated on me, I was humiliated, especially when the girl he cheated with made it her mission to tell everyone in our small town. The gossip spread like wildfire, and it hurt me deeply. To cope with the pain, I created a fake Facebook account, pretending to be a boy, and added her as a friend. For 8 months, I became her confidant. She shared all her secrets with me, and I listened carefully, pretending to be supportive. Eventually, I reached a point where I asked her to send me some personal photos. She agreed, and those photos ended up being shared around town, along with screenshots of our conversations. The consequences were devastating for her. She was expelled from school, and her family completely cut ties with her. Her life unraveled, and she faced so much backlash that she was forced to move to a different town. Last I heard, she was struggling financially, living in tough conditions, and had no support from her disowned parents. To this day, she has no idea who I really was, and that's something I've never shared with anyone. Story 2. This isn't something terrible that will ruin my life, but it's something that makes me deeply uncomfortable. I have a mild case of psoriasis, and there's one spot on my body that bothers me more than the rest. It's around my lower area, and it's essentially a rash that never fully goes away. Every night, it gets unbearably itchy, and I end up scratching and peeling the skin. Sometimes it even bleeds a little, though it's almost like an impulse I can't resist. To manage it, I take fish oil supplements and go tanning, since both are said to help. While they seem to work for other areas of my skin, this one spot doesn't improve. I think it's because I can't stop scratching it, and that only makes it worse. Story 3. This isn't something that would ruin my life, but it's a secret I've carried with me for a long time. My grandfather was the most important person in my life. He even moved from New Jersey to Florida just so we could spend more time together. He was my best friend, and we did everything together. Eventually, he was diagnosed with cancer, and my mom, even though she was no longer married to my dad, took on the responsibility of caring for him. She's an amazing person for doing that. As he grew weaker, it became harder to communicate with him, and watching him slowly fade away was heartbreaking. He stayed in my room for a while, and I slept on the couch. It was hard seeing him like that, but that's not the secret I'm talking about. When he first moved in, he had about $400 in cash, which he left on my dresser. Even as he grew weaker, he never touched it. When he went into hospice care, the money was still there, so I decided to hide it. I was only around 12 at the time, and it felt like a small fortune. I thought I was just keeping it safe for him, waiting for him to get better. But as it turns out, people don't leave hospice care when they're in that condition. When he passed away, my whole world fell apart. My dad and uncle began fighting over his inheritance, but I still kept the $400. Part of me felt like it was meant for me, but another part of me felt guilty for keeping it. I struggled with that for a long time. Eventually, karma seemed to come into play. My grandfather left my sister and me about $10,000 to use when we turned 18 or 21. My dad, without much financial knowledge, decided to invest it. Then the dot-com bubble burst, and that was the end of my little inheritance. But there's more. When I was in college and struggling financially, I sold all the baseball cards my dad had left me, his pride and joy. I justified it by telling myself it was necessary since he stopped supporting my mom. And one more thing. I sold the autographed baseball my grandfather gave me, the one signed by Ted Williams himself. That ball meant so much to me because of my grandfather's influence. I deeply regret letting it go, especially now. If I could turn back time, I would have kept it forever. But I still have his purple heart, and I look at it often. Story 4. When I was about 14, my mom was very busy with her new business, and my brother was off at college, so I was mostly left to fend for myself. My older sister, who was 22 at the time and had practically raised me, stepped in to help because my grades were slipping, and I wasn't going to school regularly. I wasn't a bad kid. I was just lazy. My sister had a boyfriend, Joe, who had been around for as long as I could remember. He was a mechanic, laid back, and from Los Angeles. He was about 4 years older than my sister, and he had a thing for low riders. One evening, I asked him if I could go cruising with him just for fun. He agreed, but told me not to tell my sister, since I'd usually need her permission at my age. Naively, I promised I wouldn't say anything. I thought we'd just go to a car show or something, but instead, Joe took me to a local arcade and restaurant. He drank quite a bit, and on the way back, the conversation took a strange turn. He started talking about physical boundaries and tried to make me question what was acceptable. I was young and didn't fully understand his intentions, but I could feel something wasn't right. Then he told me we needed to get a hotel room because he couldn't drive home after drinking. I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't know what else to do, especially since I couldn't drive myself. Once we got to the room, he made me feel even more uneasy. I was scared and unsure of how to handle the situation. The night left me feeling broken and isolated. I was overwhelmed with shame and fear and didn't tell anyone. A few months later, Joe called me and pressured me further, saying that if I didn't bury the hatchet his way, he'd tell my sister his side of the story. This manipulation continued for years, with Joe sending me coded messages. My sister, seeing Joe as family, never suspected anything was wrong. I felt trapped and forced to comply just to spare her the heartbreak. Over time, I became more and more defeated. It got to the point where I felt like I had no control over my life. The experience shattered my trust in others and left me struggling emotionally, something I still deal with today. Joe is still with my sister, and she remains one of the closest people in my life. It's painful, especially since she went through something similar in her youth and promised to protect me. I've chosen to pretend nothing happened, even though it's incredibly difficult. I have trust issues and anger that stem from what I endured, but I've stayed silent. Sharing this here, even with strangers on the internet, feels like a small release. Story 5. I'm in a much better place now, happy, confident, and surrounded by people who respect me. But looking back to my teenage years, I had a strange phase where I would sneak out late at night and wander onto farms. At the time, I didn't really understand the feelings driving me. It was a confusing period influenced by a lot of things happening in my life. I was dealing with a complex family situation, having a mother who was unpredictable and often controlling. There was a lot of tension at home, and sometimes things even got physical. I often felt isolated and misunderstood. Therapy played a crucial role in helping me move beyond those difficult years. It wasn't easy, but it helped me confront painful family issues and establish healthier boundaries. I've learned to distance myself from the negativity and focus on the people who truly support me. Now, I'm in a much healthier mental space, feeling more complete and successful than ever before. My girlfriend has been a huge support, even helping me reconnect with my grandmother. She understands why I've chosen to distance myself from certain family members, and that's been crucial for my emotional well-being. These days, I surround myself with people who lift me up, and I've been able to leave the past behind. I have friends waiting for me now, so I'll wrap it up here. Story 6. This is my first post on Reddit, so here it goes. I know I have a few psychological issues, and I'm aware that I need help. But for some reason, I'm not ready to seek it. Deep down, I know I struggle with dark thoughts, and in a strange way, I've come to accept that part of me. It's not an easy topic to face, especially because my biological dad has never been in my life, and sometimes I feel disconnected from my half-siblings. They're all athletic and successful in their own ways, while I'm the only musical one in the family. This difference has created a lot of emotional stress, especially since I also deal with bipolar depression and severe anxiety. I've been in mental institutions, seen therapists, and talked to school counselors, but nothing really seems to help. Often, I just pretend to feel better, so people will leave me alone. The pressure builds up over time, and I don't always know how to cope. I stopped taking my meds because they dull my creativity, and music is the one thing that makes me feel alive. It's not ideal to stop my medication, I know, but I just don't enjoy taking so many pills every day. especially since I'm only 19. I'm attending community college, but I'm not sure what I want to do with my life. Writing and performing music are my passions, but it's hard to imagine a career in that. Sometimes I feel like a failure, living at home with no job, no money, and struggling in school. The pressure has been building for years, and I've even started self-harming as a way to deal with it. Music is my escape, but sometimes I don't know if it's enough to keep me going. Story 7. When I was about 12, back in the days of 56K modems, I started exploring the internet when my parents were out of the house. One day, I stumbled upon a cam site. Things were different back then with billing. There was no need to enter a credit card. You just clicked accept on the site's front page, and the charges went through the phone line. I ended up having a simple conversation with someone, like any other online chat. Then, out of nowhere, a window popped up showing a bill for a private chat, and it was around $700. I realized what had happened and freaked out. I immediately cleared the history and temporary files, thinking I could make the whole thing disappear. A few months later, my parents received an unusually high phone bill for a service they didn't recognize. They asked me about it, and I denied knowing anything. They called the phone company and claimed it was a mistake, and somehow, the bill was dropped. So, at 12 years old, I unintentionally got $700 worth of service without paying for it. I feel guilty about it to this day, especially because I never told anyone what really happened. I guess, in the end, it was just a weird mistake I got away with. Story 8. I've been on Reddit for a while, but this is my first time posting. Reading some of the stories here has brought back guilt and shame, feelings I've tried to forget for almost 10 years. When I was 18, my mom remarried and moved out of state. She let me stay in the house because she didn't want it to be empty. At the time, I was working as a dancer and had dropped out of high school. Looking back, it was probably a bad idea to leave me on my own. My boyfriend at the time was everything I could have wanted, kind, intelligent, and seemingly out of my league. About a year into our relationship, he had a crisis, feeling like he was missing out on life. He broke up with me, and I was heartbroken. Things got more complicated when I couldn't afford to live on my income. I ended up starting a relationship with an older man who had been interested in me for a long time. He moved in to help with expenses, but I was unhappy. He eventually discovered my online diary, so I started pretending in my entries that everything was fine. A few months later, my ex-boyfriend found my diary while looking for my email address and read everything I had written about the other guy. He was upset, but I couldn't explain myself, especially with the other guy right there. I asked him to call me the next day, but he never did. Months later, one of his friends came to my door to tell me he had passed away in a car accident. There was no sympathy in his tone, and I realized his friends must have thought I was a terrible person. Later, I found out my ex had been looking for my email to send me a letter. A friend gave it to me, and it was full of apologies, telling me he wanted to try again and that he loved me. My world shattered. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and I lost a lot of weight. The man I was living with became angry that I wasn't moving on and treated me poorly. Eventually, he left, taking everything from the house. I was left with nothing, not even power. Things are better now, but I still have lasting health issues. I always feel like his passing was somehow my fault, like everything that happened afterward was a punishment. Story 9. In college, I had a fraternity brother who was incredibly difficult to deal with, and he made my life miserable by hazing me. The system back then allowed students to log in to register for classes, and as a senior, he had first pick. It was around the time the internet was becoming widely used, and logins were as simple as entering your name and a PIN, which was usually your birthday. One day, I logged into his account and dropped all his classes 3 days after they started. He didn't realize what happened until midterms, when the professors submitted his grades. By that point, it was too late for him to fix things. The school ended up refunding his tuition, but he had to spend an extra semester in college to make up for the lost classes. I never told him it was me. He probably never found out, but I still feel a strange satisfaction from it. Story 10. My parents never cared much about me. They told me I was an accident, and whenever we fought, they'd throw it in my face. I was the reason they stayed together for 18 years. But their marriage was miserable, and the environment I grew up in was tense and often frightening. I experienced both emotional and physical neglect and abuse. There were times when we didn't even have enough food, so I didn't start eating regular meals until I was in college. Because of this, I've always craved attention, particularly from men. It started when I was 14, and I became emotionally attached to any man who seemed to care. This led to some painful relationships, including one where a partner held me down during an argument. Later in my 20s, I caught an illness, and though I eventually moved in with a kind man who genuinely cared for me, he eventually broke up with me because of my insecurities and emotional baggage. Now, I have 3 friends, but we're more like drinking buddies than anything meaningful. I have no relationship with my family. They never reach out. I feel completely alone. Every morning, I cry before heading to work. Most people can probably see how broken I am, but I can't talk about it. No one really cares about the sad, struggling girl. Story 11. I'm not sure if anyone will read this, but I've read all the comments here, so I'm sure someone will. There are a few things I've kept to myself that I've never shared with anyone. For some context, I'm a 21-year-old female. When I was around 5, I had a neighbor girl who was about 5 years older than me. One day, while we were playing, she took me to her basement and tried to explain things to me that I couldn't comprehend at that age. She encouraged me to act things out in a way I didn't fully understand. Growing up, she continued to act strangely around me. When I was about 13, I became really into anime and joined online art communities. I spent a lot of time drawing and, as many young teens do, posted some of my drawings online. Now, I feel embarrassed about them. One evening, my stepdad came into my room holding a printed copy of one of my drawings. I was mortified and expected to be in trouble, but instead, he made an inappropriate comment about it. I've never felt more uncomfortable in my life. All 3 of my pregnancies were planned by me, without my husband knowing. He wasn't opposed to having children. He loves them dearly, but he never realized that I had planned each one. I still feel a little guilty about that. When I was 16, I went to a friend's party and was the designated sober friend. After everyone went to bed, I found a spot in one of the rooms to sleep. I didn't realize 2 other people were in there. At some point, one of them woke up and acted inappropriately. I was too shocked and scared to react properly. I didn't know how to stop him without making things worse, and I felt so embarrassed. That experience left me feeling scared and vulnerable, but I didn't know who to tell. Later that year, I flew out an online friend I'd known since I was young. We talked for years, and I thought he was a great person, but when he visited, he became aggressive, both verbally and physically. His behavior shocked and hurt me. He damaged some of my things and showed a side of him I'd never seen before. I try not to think about the painful parts of my life, but they linger. I grew up in a challenging household, and though it's not a secret to most people who know me, sharing this here feels like I'm finally getting it off my chest. My husband doesn't even know about these things. Story 12. Okay, so with thousands of comments here, there's basically no chance this will stand out, but maybe 1 or 2 people will see it. Here it goes. I have a foot-related preference that might seem trivial to some. A lot of people probably think it's strange or unusual, but it's not something that would ruin a life, right? At least, that's what I try to tell myself. But to me, the thought of anyone finding out is overwhelming. I fear the shame more than anything else. I feel like my life would be ruined, and the anger I'd feel toward anyone who spread it around would be intense. I'm not a violent person, but that would be my one exception. After that, even prison wouldn't seem like a big deal. My girlfriend knows about it. I told her in a moment of deep trust, and she's fine with it. She lets me express myself in my own way and would never tell anyone, no matter how angry she might get at me someday. My best friend knows, too, but only because I knew he wouldn't judge me. I even told him I'd be furious if he ever mentioned it, and he believes me. It feels strange typing this out, but maybe this kind of attitude is normal for people with unique preferences. I don't know. Story 13. When I was around 8 to 10 years old, I had an unusual and complicated relationship with my sister, who is about a year and a half older than me. It started innocently, like playing doctor, but eventually progressed further. Whenever our parents would leave us home alone, we would go to the farthest part of the house, where we felt safe. I can't remember exactly what I was thinking back then, but I don't recall feeling like it was wrong. All I cared about was not getting caught. When I turned 10, it just stopped, and I don't remember why. We never spoke about it again. Over 20 years later, I've never told anyone or brought it up with her. It hasn't seemed to affect me emotionally as an adult, but I sometimes wonder if it's the reason my sister and I don't have a close relationship. I'm close with my other sibling, but I want a better connection with my sister. The thing is, I don't know how to bring it up without reopening old wounds. Today, I'm married, have children, and enjoy a healthy relationship with my wife. I don't think about it much, but when I saw this thread, it brought it all back to mind. I'm grateful for those who have shared their stories here. It makes me feel less alone. In terms of how it's affected me, it hasn't inhibited my adult relationships. But some things still linger, and I sometimes reflect on how to move forward. Story 14. I've had a secret second life that I've never shared with anyone. Growing up, I was a fairly typical boy, good grades, decent social life. But when I turned 14, my curiosity and adventurous side came out, and I started meeting up with people online who were much older than me. There was no coercion. I enjoyed every minute of it, even sneaking out of my parents' house for these adventures. By the time I was 16, I wanted to add more excitement to these experiences, and I found that many of these people were willing to pay for my time. Throughout my late teens, I occasionally accepted money from people I met online. I didn't need the money, but it added excitement to my life, and I used a good portion of it for university expenses. I even had a few personal training clients, but I mostly kept it casual. The thrill was my real motivation. Through the internet, I discovered various interests and engaged with people who had very specific tastes. Over time, I learned how to keep this part of my life separate, and it never interfered with my studies or personal growth. I managed to complete my degree debt-free and have since moved forward with my life. I don't feel particularly guilty about it, since I was careful and stayed in control of my choices. But if this secret part of my life were ever exposed, I'd probably feel the need to make a fresh start somewhere else. Story 15. First, let me say I'm female. When I was younger, around grades 2 and 3, I had a series of encounters with my older female cousins. At that age, I was already surprisingly aware of certain things, which always puzzled me. Recently, I found out that I have 3 times the level of testosterone compared to the average female, which might explain my early awareness. It all started with my oldest cousin. We spent a lot of time together, and things gradually developed. Shortly after, my second oldest cousin and I also became close in similar ways, although I honestly can't remember how it started. My third cousin eventually found out, and we ended up spending time together as well. We were young, but we talked about relationships and were surprisingly knowledgeable for our age. There was even a time when I felt a strong sense of jealousy when I learned that 2 of my cousins were close, too. Looking back, I think this may have contributed to how I approach relationships and to my bisexuality today. It's all long over now, and I'm still close with my cousins, despite the distance between us. We haven't mentioned anything about it since it last happened over 9 or 10 years ago. Story 16. TLDR at the top because I like it on top. I was extremely curious about things as a kid, and my parents decided that ignoring it was the best solution. This led to years of anxiety, feeling like I was a terrible person. Eventually, I realized that I'm just a normal person who had parents who didn't know how to handle my curiosity. Growing up, I was taught that anything other than abstinence until marriage was wrong. I remember being curious, even as a young child, having thoughts and questions that I didn't quite understand. When I was around 12, I asked my mom a lot of questions, and she mostly dodged them. Shortly afterward, my dad sat me down and explained that intimacy was something only for a husband and wife, and anything else was wrong. When I asked more questions, he admitted that his father didn't have answers either, so the talk turned into more of an explanation of why I wasn't going to get any real answers. This led me to the internet, where I spent many late nights secretly searching for answers. My parents eventually caught on and grounded me, but it turned into a game for me. I learned how to delete history and find ways around parental controls. At one point, feeling confused and frustrated, I even looked at my dog in ways that make me cringe now. I thought that somehow this made me a terrible person, and I lived with that guilt for years. But as I grew older, I began to understand that these thoughts and curiosities were just part of growing up. I no longer carry the burden of that guilt. I now realize that it was a normal, though misunderstood, part of development. I'm sharing this now because I've never told anyone before, and I feel ready to let it go. I don't feel guilty about it anymore, just relieved that I can move on. Story 17. I live in a neighborhood that's known for its iffy safety. I'm a bit of a scrawny kid in a mostly Mexican area. Shootings happen nearly every week. Gangs roam the streets. Any car not kept in a garage is prone to break-ins, and home invasions are a regular issue. It's not the ideal place to feel safe, especially being one of the few non-locals in the area. At my mom's insistence, I went ahead and got a concealed carry permit. After some practice and training, I started carrying a Springfield 1911 A1 with me whenever I left the house, just in case. One day, my car was giving me trouble, so I decided to walk over to a nearby auto shop to pick up a part. As I was halfway there, I noticed 3 suspicious-looking guys walking my way. I didn't make eye contact and just tried to look straight ahead, but they were staring at me. When one crossed the street, I knew this wasn't a good situation. The 3 of them moved into positions, one right in front of me, one behind me, and the last guy across the street. They stopped me and demanded my wallet and phone. I handed them over slowly. Then, to my horror, they told me to get down on my knees. My heart felt like it was about to explode out of my chest, and I had a horrible feeling they weren't just going to rob me. The guy in front of me pulled out a knife. I heard what sounded like the clack of a gun behind me, and the guy across the street had a weapon, too. My body went into overdrive. I turned around, pushed the guy behind me down with all my strength, pulled out my 1911 and fired 2 shots into his chest. Then, I spun around and shot the guy with the knife once in the neck and once in the chest. The last guy across the street started shooting at me, but missed, so I fired 4 rounds into him until he stopped moving. After it was over, I realized what I had done, and panic hit me hard. I started hyperventilating. I wasn't prepared for something like this. I'd never expected to actually use my gun, so I was mentally unprepared. In my shock, I picked up my shells, retrieved my wallet and phone, and ran all the way home. I was in such a state of fear and confusion that I didn't even think about calling the police. I was completely overwhelmed and stayed that way for days. 3 days later, I saw the story on the local news. It was about 3 teenagers, no older than 17, who had been killed. I couldn't believe it. They reported that one of the weapons behind me had actually been a pellet gun. Later that day, someone knocked on my door. It was a man from the neighborhood who had witnessed everything. He told me he had already spoken to the police and claimed it was just gang violence. He said he knew me and my mother and didn't want to see us get into trouble, especially considering how those 3 had been causing problems in the area. He even mentioned that 2 of them had been involved in terrible acts, which shocked me even more. He thanked me for what I had done, shook my hand, and assured me that the police were treating it as an open and shut case of gang violence. While his words made me feel slightly better, I still can't forget what happened that day. I'm seeing a therapist to help me work through it, but the memory stays with me. No matter the circumstances or what those men had done, taking a life is something I'm struggling to come to terms with, even if I had no choice. Story 18. I realize this thread is probably old by now, but it took a lot for me to get the courage to create a throwaway account and actually post these confessions. I have a few secrets, some of which I've never told a soul. My adult content preferences are very specific, and I often find myself drawn to themes that part of me feels conflicted about. I know my family, who are very conservative Christians, would be horrified if they found out. I don't have any real-life inclinations or anything, but being temporarily back at my parents' place, where privacy is limited, makes it feel even stranger. Growing up in such a restrictive environment probably led me to explore these things further, but I still feel like it's something I need to keep hidden. I recently got out of the military. My role was combat-oriented, but my unit was never deployed to active war zones like Iraq or Afghanistan. However, we did spend time stationed in the Philippines, where I had an experience that stuck with me. One night, after a lot of drinking, I ended up in a place I shouldn't have been. I chose someone I thought was younger because I felt like it might lower the risk of health issues. Looking back, I worry about her age. After the fact, I learned about the cultural norms in the area and realized that my actions may have left someone with lasting consequences. That night still haunts me, as I worry that I left a situation unresolved that I can never go back and make right. Even if I wanted to find her, it would be impossible due to the way things are set up there. My military training was intense, and my role involved being prepared for combat situations, although I never actually went into active duty. I sometimes feel like there's a part of me that still wonders about the experience. I've been approached on 3 different occasions about working in dangerous areas for private groups, and while I ultimately declined, I found myself thinking about what it would be like to face life-or-death situations. There's a strange draw to the intensity of it, though I know the reality would be far different than anything I've imagined. The thought of it still lingers, like a challenge I haven't fully overcome. Story 19. This thread may be one of the best examples of how many people who feel sad, alone, or even truly ostracized from society are, in fact, not alone. Everyone has burdens, some heavier than others, but it's essential to understand that we are all fellow humans just trying to navigate life and make it through. There's a lot of complicated stuff here, but these are people's lives and experiences we're talking about. So the next time you see someone who seems down, or even just a stranger in general, consider taking that extra moment to say hello, ask them how they're doing, or compliment a friend. You never know when your small act of kindness might be the thing that gives someone a little boost of happiness they need to get through the day. We've seen countless examples of kindness here on Reddit. It's entirely possible to make a difference in someone's life with a simple gesture. Nearly every story here is a testament to that. Just remember, even a small act can change someone's world. Story 20. I know this is probably lost in the sea of posts, but I just feel like I need to say it. Sometimes it helps to share things, even if no one is listening. I don't know if this would ruin my life, but it's something I will never tell anyone personally. It's one of those secrets that stays with me forever. The truth is, I really struggle with myself. I feel like I have a lot of self-hatred, and there are moments when I think about ending things, but I can never bring myself to go through with it. Every time these thoughts come up, I think about my family and friends, and then I realize I couldn't put them through that. I think especially about my mom and my brother. My brother and I are best friends, and he's mine. I can't imagine hurting him or my mom that way. Even though I often struggle with myself, they seem to see something good in me, and I wouldn't want them to suffer because of how I feel. So I go on living with every small mistake and those little things eating away at me. I mess up often over small, stupid things, and I have a hard time letting them go. Even things I did years ago still bother me. It's like every time I make a mistake, all the old ones come flooding back. I'm terrible with people. I make errors, and it all just makes me dislike myself even more. Sometimes I daydream about things ending in a way where it wouldn't have to be my choice, but those thoughts are just part of what I go through. Maybe I'm rambling, but I just needed to put it out there. Thank you for this thread. I really needed to get that off my chest. Story 21. I get insanely, overwhelmingly attached to my guy friends, even those who are barely more than acquaintances. I have a boyfriend, and I truly love him, but I find myself fantasizing about his friends, my friends, and almost all of my male friends, except him. It's gotten to a point where I feel possessive of people who aren't mine in any sense. In my mind, they're mine, and I sometimes wish they would stay single forever because of that attachment. It feels wrong, I know, but I still find myself thinking they aren't allowed to have girlfriends. When one of my college friends started dating someone, I felt intense jealousy, even though I see him more often than she does during school. I obsess over my guy friends to a level that sometimes feels a bit over the top. I've even gone as far as looking up details about them that I'm pretty sure they wouldn't want me to know, like their license plate numbers. Once, I sat staring at a photo of one of them for a full hour, just caught up in my own thoughts. This issue has gotten so strong that I sometimes create alternate realities in my mind where each of these people is mine. Sometimes I imagine each person separately, and other times I imagine us all together in a way that probably only makes sense to me. There have been moments when I felt ashamed talking to my boyfriend because, at the beginning of our relationship, this issue nearly ruined us. I've been doing my best to spend more time with him, since he helps to push those thoughts away. Being with him calms my mind, and I'm grateful for that because I don't want to let these obsessions control my life. How do you like the stories? What do you think about them? Subscribe to the channel and like this video.
See you on the next video.